This is Verdorin, I'm Pierre Delancey. Liberal democracies don't age gracefully. Established systems of governance, like those of the UK and the US, which once served as blueprints for other nations, are today experiencing a profound crisis for legitimacy. In Britain, a landslide general election result was quickly followed by a catastrophic tumble in approval ratings. Meanwhile, in the last US presidential campaign, voters were told that democracy itself was on the ballot, with both candidates suggesting that the election might be the last ever. The consensus underpinning the world's most powerful democracies is, indeed, waning. The populaces have developed a deep dissatisfaction with the government's political conduct for some time, yet no credible alternatives have emerged. In his latest book, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, Benjamin Studebaker argues that the kinds of disagreement which historically led to political violence today instead just linger throughout the state and society. Without alternatives, liberal democracy's legitimation crisis leads to neither reform nor revolution. Benjamin Studebaker is a political theorist. He holds a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. He has written for Aeon, Sublation, Compact, Current Affairs, The Bellows, The Huffington Post, among others. He hosts Political Theory 101 and co-hosts the film podcast The Lack. Benjamin is also the author of The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. You can find my conversation with him about this text on this very channel. This conversation was recorded live in front of an audience at Verdorin in London in December 2024. As ever, you'll find links to further information, a copy of the book, as well as ways to support the project in the show notes. Today, I'm incredibly happy to meet in the flesh Benjamin Studebaker.
Thanks for having me, Pierre.
You clearly have had a very good year, because I interviewed you maybe 18 months ago about your first book, which was called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, with a beautiful subtitle, The Way is Shut, which was about as depressing as it sounds, but in a way that I find really astute and completely get off on. This book, however, only has one chapter on despair. So things have been going well. Without necessarily spilling the beans, I'm essentially encouraging you to tell me why things have been going well, and to those of our audience who don't necessarily know you, to give them sort of a trajectory or your intellectual biography to explain how you've come to the question of legitimacy that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, so I come from Indiana in the United States. I did my BA at Warwick. I came over here because I did not want to do anything other than politics, and the UK system allows that, for which I am eternally grateful. Then I did my master's degree at the University of Chicago and then my PhD at Cambridge. When I started out, it was, normative questions about justice initially that got me. I was going, well, how come this political system never delivers on conceptions of justice that seem potentially persuasive to me? And the more I studied that, the more I realized, you can't even begin to ask that question because nobody agrees about justice. Nobody agrees about it. And so what you end up doing is you end up having these arguments that go in circles and circles and circles about how things ought to be, and you never actually get to what's going on. And you never actually deal with any of the real problems that exist. And so when I came to Chicago and I was doing my master's, I thought, well, maybe, regardless of what you think about things like economic inequality, maybe they're a problem because they threaten order. Maybe they're disruptive to the system in some way. And I wrote my master's thesis. It was called The Return of Depression Politics. And it was very much about this idea.
Jolly.
Yeah. No, this is what I used to be like. I
Really see how things change. We'll open it out later.
Yeah. And it was very much about, are the 30s coming back? Because now we have levels of economic inequality that are like the 30s. And I wrote this back in 2014. And then I grew up, because I did a PhD, and then all of these people who were much older than me started adopting the view that I had in my master's thesis when I was a child, which I found very peculiar, because that position is very infantile. And yet, where did I go from there? Well, I started thinking, it's not simply the case that we all respond to conditions we don't like by organizing together to do politics or to do a revolution or even to elect somebody who wants to do any of those things. We don't seem to straightforwardly do that. And throughout the tens, I just observed that every time anybody tried to do anything, there would be all of these disagreements that would come up. They would be incredibly unproductive. They would often be motivated by things that had nothing seemingly to do with politics. And I found myself in 2015, 16, 17, I used to be very much for Bernie Sanders. I was trying to get people to vote for Bernie Sanders. And so I would try to make all of these arguments. Why are we saying all of these things that alienate people that we need to vote for the candidate or for the party if we're going to be able to get a majority and do things like Medicare for all? Why are we doing that? And initially, it just struck me that people just must be making mistakes, and maybe they just need me to give them an argument and explain to them why it's not strategic. But then I grew up some more. And I realized that there are real reasons why people do the things that they do. There are real reasons, and we do actually have to take them seriously. And if people are motivated in such a way that they're going to come into conflict, such that we can't do a lot of the things that we'd like to do, and if there are actual reasons for that, it's not just the case that no one has come along who's smart enough to give them the best speech and debate argument, then we have a real problem that can't just be resolved with me talking. And that's in part why in all of these books that I'm doing now, I don't end by saying, oh, here's what you should do, because it's my observation that that doesn't work. But it is very lucrative, and I've noticed a lot of academics still like to end their books with the here's what you should do, and they like to act as if everybody would just read the book, then they would all be convinced, and then the problems would go away. But I don't think it works like that.
Well, I can attest, having spent a couple of days reading the book, there are no solutions in it whatsoever, but there is a change between your last book. So I wonder, just to go along with your joke for a moment, whether explaining why people don't do certain things in your previous book, why explaining why people do them, despite knowing that it's not for the best, whether that's going to be somehow more lucrative, whether for you or for us. So we're going to be talking about the question of legitimacy in liberal democracies, and we're going to stick with the book quite tightly for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a conversation and a break in between. So the concepts will be legitimacy and democracy, and I'm going to start with a super undergraduate question. What on earth is democracy? And I ask this because a couple of weeks ago I bumped into someone at an event by Ben Burgess, and for some reason I was kind of dragged into a 20-minute conversation about what democracy is. And the conversation was completely stuck on the question of proportional representation. But you must realize, the man kept on saying to me, we don't live in democracy because we don't have PR. And, I kept on saying, but, the demos, it just means it's not an oligarchy. It just means I just wouldn't have it. So what is democracy, and why is this worth studying in this kind of technical sense that you've got up to?
I think the short answer is that we don't know what it means anymore. We don't know what it is. We don't agree on what it means. And that's in part why we really struggle to get anywhere when we talk. I think that you can use a kind of minimalist definition to get off the ground, like a system where there are multiple political parties that are both competitive and both sometimes win elections. But very few people would be satisfied with just that. Most people want a lot of other things in addition to that, but there is no agreement about what those other things should be. And I think that is really distinctive. I think a lot of the time when people are making normative arguments about what should happen, they want to argue for democratization, that we should have more democracy or better democracy than we have now. And they often operate under the premise that there is some kind of implicit knowledge that we have of what that is or what it contains. But I think this is a huge mistake. I think one of the things that marks this whole period is that we actually have no idea, and the term is more confusing than it is helpful in most of the situations in which it's used.
Yeah, I get that. I got that sense from the book very, 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 very quickly. And so I'm wondering whether it's feasible to attempt a definition, just indulge me for a moment, by trying to maybe catch a couple of kind of positive aspects of democracy and negative. And I'm saying this kind of through gritted teeth because we love to say that we're in a crisis. We have a crisis of meaning. We have a crisis of democracy, of politics, and polycrisis. Was some conversation earlier. what is it that's wrong with democracy at a level that's useful to a discussion, and what is it that we still want to preserve, and as much as we're bothering to have this conversation?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. One is that the things that you get out of democracy or that people want out of democracy often conflict with each other. So that the more that you pursue one of these things, the more that you tend to not get other ones that are also genuinely important to many people. So a straightforward example from my book would be dynamism or credibility, right? Dynamic institutions are capable of making change. If you read, centrist, boring, establishment, liberal democratic theory, there's often a strong emphasis on dynamism. An authoritarian state will get stuck with one party or one policy, and it will really struggle to change what it's doing. And you have people in the literature who argue that this leads to famines, it leads to all kinds of disasters. But in democracy, you can vote out the incumbents, get somebody else who then should, in principle, be able to do something else, right? At the same time, you've also got a lot of these institutionalists who will talk about credibility and the rule of law and consistency, and the investor class knowing what the government's going to do and knowing that it's not going to do certain kinds of things like seize their property. Now, a system that's credible is committed in some way to a status quo and doesn't change what it's doing very quickly or very easily, and not without quite a bit of signaling. But a system that's dynamic can respond very quickly to resentments and input from the public. Generally, if people want a more dynamic system, the cost of this is that it will be less credible and more destabilizing. And generally, if people want a more credible system, to credibly commit that system to the status quo, they'll have to take away some of its dynamism. You can also see this in terms of how do we think about what authoritarianism is? Some people think of authoritarianism as an individual, a tyrant, or a particular part of the state, say the legislature or the court system, having so much power that it becomes impossible to stop and it can just impose its will in an arbitrary and capricious way. But then there are other people who think about authoritarianism as a kind of totalitarianism, an impersonal bureaucratic system that is stronger than all of the people who participate in it, that answers to no one, that's opaque and impossible to fully comprehend, much less oppose. Now, those are almost completely opposite visions of what authoritarianism is. If you think you live in a totalitarian society, then you need to weaken the impersonal system and make the particular people who participate in the system stronger so that they can modify its incentives and get it to produce different results. But if you're concerned about tyranny, then what you need is a rule of law with institutions that prevent particular people from exercising so much arbitrary and capricious power. So you can have a situation where people are trying to defend democracy, but in completely opposite ways, where some people are trying to oppose tyranny and want a more credible state, and other people are trying to oppose totalitarianism and want a more dynamic state. And these people will think of each other as authoritarian, and that's even before we litigate other things, like the electoral system, or whether there should be judicial review, or what the relationship should be between the nation-state institutions and the supranational structures like the EU, the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, right? What's a democracy? It gets incredibly difficult very fast.
All right, I'm so sorry that there's no help here. Let's see if we can do any better with the second word in the title. Sorry, it's very facetious of me. I didn't quite mean to do this. Well, we have actually missold this event to you. We title it Illegitimate Democracies, but actually we're not going to be talking about banana republics at all. We're not even going to be talking about the bleak future of the American democracy that's about to come and consume us all from January. So I wanted to ask you about the kind of broad definition of legitimacy as a concept that keeps this kind of imperfect system going. And you have an example in the book which kind of frames it quite well, which is the battle for delegitimizing the election results in 2020 in the US. Trump tried as hard as he could to overturn, in inverted quotes, the election results, but democracy prevailed. I'm doing air quotes all the time at this stage. Yet in Britain, we had a kind of counterexample, the Brexit referendum, this was like the most democratic thing that has ever happened. The people have spoken, and somehow democracy of that vote produced a counter-democratic response, which was like, well, let's have another vote, shall we? Because we love democracy so much, we have to undo them. And I've set these two examples up so that you can speak about legitimacy in a kind of simple level, but also its obverse, which is the kind of ideological legitimation of systems. So I'm struck by the idea that you can at the one time have a system of narratives that kind of let you stick with a dysfunctional system, and almost the same system of stories, but somehow it's not positive. So yeah, legitimacy and ideology is sort of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, so legitimacy is to do with whether people accept the system, right? Now, you can think of that in a binary way in terms of accept or reject, but I think that there are at least 4 different levels of acceptance of the political system. We could talk about perfect legitimacy, a situation where everybody accepts everything that happens and endorses absolutely everything the state does, right? A dystopian and unrealistic situation that we never see, right? Then you've got full legitimacy. In full legitimacy, people endorse the procedures, but they sometimes disagree with the decisions that the procedures make. They nonetheless think that the procedures are fair enough that they have a good chance of winning next time. So they're good losers when they don't get what they want, right? Underneath that, you would have minimal legitimacy. In minimal legitimacy, we agree on what type of system we should have, but we don't agree on how that system should be procedurally realized. We might agree that we want democracy, but we don't agree about what it means or what procedures we should use to institute it, bring it about, maintain it, right? Nevertheless, because we want democracy, if something seems obviously authoritarian to us, it's off the table and we won't do it. And if there's something we could do that we think might have authoritarian results, we won't go near it, we won't touch it, right? In liminal legitimacy, the level beneath even that, we lose our commitment to democracy as a value. We unironically and with total sincerity, not kidding, not memeing, not playing any games, not trying to make money online, but really sincerely organize together to produce some other kind of system of government. So in the 20th century, in a lot of accounts of legitimacy that you can go read, Robert Dahl, Jürgen Habermas, Reinhard Koselleck, in these accounts, the assumption is that there's a state and a society, that these things are usually in some way connected to each other, that there's some relationship of representation between the two, but that this can break down and the two things can become estranged from each other. And when there's estrangement, something has to happen to bring them back together. So either the state has to make concessions to society, or the state has to repress society or ideologically reconstitute society to bring it into alignment with itself, or society will overcome the state and revolutionize it. But if you think that revolutions will only produce things like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, if you don't think that you're actually able to bring about a different and better system, then you can't go down into liminal legitimacy, and you can't have the kind of crisis that these theorists all talked about over and over. And these are centrist theorists, left-wing theorists, right-wing theorists. It doesn't matter what your ideological background is. If you're looking at people from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is how they were thinking, just about across the board in the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, there was obviously another system you could pick. There was obviously something else you could do. At least one other thing, if not more than one other thing, right? What's changed is that we've gone through the world wars, the Soviet Union has collapsed, Nazi Germany has collapsed, and so we don't necessarily think there's something else to do. And since we don't think there's something else to do, we get stuck at liminal legitimacy, where the furthest we can go is disagreeing about what democracy means and trying to relitigate the procedures. But the reason that we're stuck there is that as soon as somebody does something that you really disagree with, what do you call it? Communism or fascism? Authoritarianism? That's the first thing you call it, because that's the one thing we all know that we don't want, with the exception of very, very small numbers of people, most of whom are kidding and faking it for clout online. Right? If you look at the 2020 election, the disagreement is about the electoral law. You have Republicans who are claiming that the changes to the electoral procedures that the Democrats instituted in response to COVID to make it easier for people to vote from home are an attempt to steal the election by making it so easy to vote that it would be impossible to prevent voter fraud, right? And then conversely, you have the Democrats saying that the Republicans are trying to suppress the vote, particularly of people who are likely to want to stay home because they care seriously about the virus, who are disproportionately Democratic voters. And then forward on from there, when the Republicans try to change the rules after 2020, they are accused of trying to repress minority votes, the votes of poor people, the votes of people who are unlikely to possess valid voter ID, right? Each of these groups accuses the other of being authoritarian, but they just have very different notions of what makes for a free and fair election. They're accusing each other of strategic election manipulation, something that in the literature is framed as that's an authoritarian procedural reform. But once you break your consensus about how you vote, it's not so simple as to just have some liberal centrist theorist go, this is a real electoral system and this is a bad one. This one is inclusive and this one isn't. Those kinds of arguments no longer convince anybody once you break this consensus and you produce these deep, deep disagreements. And the same goes for Brexit, right? If you have a referendum that says, let's do Brexit, and then you have an election where you elect MPs that don't want to do Brexit, well, each of those processes has a claim plausibly on being democratic. The problem with Brexit is that you have a contradiction between the parliamentary system, which never elects people who actually want to do Brexit, and the referendum, which demands nonetheless that it happen. This contradiction cannot easily be resolved without procedural reforms that would bring these two things into alignment with each other, or another referendum that would get rid of the imperative to have to carry out Brexit. So these things will look like attempts to attack and destroy democracy, but they all come from people who are authentically committed to democracy as they understand it. And when theorists like me go up in front of people and go, these people are authoritarians, we're just trying to win the argument. We're not actually studying it and explaining to you what's going on in theoretical terms. We're participating in it rather than studying it. And that's why I kind of frame this book as an attempt to diagnose the situation, give you a picture of what's happening, and then leave it up to you what you do. Because I do think that that is what political theory is meant to do at this stage in my life. And it took me a long time to get there because very few people are actually doing it like that these days.
We should be trying to follow some authoritarians, and I'm not necessarily going to direct us to, say, Javier Milei or indeed Trump, but your claim is specifically aimed at what you call embedded democracies. So you look at the US and the UK, these are systems that have been either constitutionally embedded or have been around so long that nobody really has any other ideas. But you talked about this kind of threat of authoritarianism when you brought in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which, in the theorizing of the 20th century, these were indeed sort of realistic alternatives, and political theory had to be written in sort of response to them. So my question to you is, do you think that alternative systems of governance have to go through the same kind of crisis of legitimation? And we haven't yet given many examples of legitimation. We'll get to that. But did the Soviet Union collapse because it had a sort of, not democratic, but did it have a crisis of the internal belief between citizens and the party and so on? Can we see this in other systems of governance? Have we indeed seen the decomposition of a similarly structured system that we could use to bring about a decomposition of our own, if that's one of the outcomes that we might be looking at?
Yeah, so an embedded democracy in the book is a democracy that's been around long enough to develop a mystique. And it can develop a mystique in a few different senses. One is that the population can identify with the political system, as you tend to see in the United States. Being American is about being committed to the American Constitution or the American political system. It can't be an ethnic or religious commitment. There's far too much pluralism for that. And attempts in the United States to push a kind of blood and soil nationalism tend to struggle as a consequence of this, right? Conversely, it can be about having outlasted many competing regimes. It can be the kind of Winston Churchill line of democracy is the worst form of government except for all others that have been tried. If the system just lasts a very, very long time and many other things are tried and fail, the more that goes on, the harder it is to imagine that something else might actually be successful. Now, because of that, it becomes much harder to envision an alternative. If you have a system where that hasn't happened, then when disagreement pops up, that disagreement potentially has a revolutionary impetus. And that compels the state to make concessions, try to modify what the population thinks, or potentially succumb to revolutionary pressure, right? The 20th century theorists of legitimacy weren't stupid or bad at theory. They were doing theory in a different context. And the way that they describe legitimacy crises fits when you're dealing with a younger democracy, a democracy where there really are meaningful alternatives that exist. And it also fits better the authoritarian states that you're talking about, right? In the Soviet Union, in the People's Republic of China, in Nazi Germany, you have regimes that are not proven in the same way. You have regimes that are not 100 years old or older. They have not outlasted many other systems of government, and there are often in these countries multiple distinct political traditions that the people in the country can draw on when they think about who they are and what they care about, right? Being Russian doesn't necessarily imply being a communist. Being German doesn't necessarily imply being a fascist. Being Chinese doesn't necessarily imply being a Maoist. Indeed, being a supporter of the Chinese Communist Party these days doesn't necessarily imply being a Maoist in the sense in which that term used to be understood. So in these states, when you have some kind of breakdown in agreement, that breakdown in agreement very quickly develops quite existential stakes, which is why these states respond either by making concessions, repressing in some way the conversation, or they are potentially revolutionized to a very significant degree. And you can have these blow-ups in these states where someone is pushed out in mysterious circumstances that are they a coup? Is this some kind of putsch? You know, we can talk about this in reference to Soviet history in terms of what happened to, say, not just Gorbachev, but also Khrushchev, right? We could talk about this in reference to the Gang of Four in China. There are these moments where disagreement gets intense, and then there's a real showdown. My contention is that in the embedded democracies that have been around long enough, you don't get that showdown, and this allows for completely different kinds of relationships to develop that have never existed before in human history. It becomes possible to have much more conflict that can be much more intense for a much longer period of time without the consequences which that conflict historically would have had, because people will not act in the way that they historically would have acted in response to that disagreement. So yes, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had legitimacy crises, but they had legitimacy crises that looked more like the crises that are described by mid-20th century theorists.
Right. I guess your supposition is that's not going to happen to us. Should we put some meat on the bone and look at some examples? So the idea of legitimacy for a democratic system, of course, is kind of still quite nebulous. We all believe in democracy, or some of us. But what are the narratives that we can actually play this out for? So in the book, you go through a couple of kind of classic examples, which I think are used in contemporary political theory. So there are things like equality and its obvious inequality, freedom, and representation. So these are the kind of three features of democracy that I guess if you played the generation game and asked people in the street to describe the features of democracy, those could be it. They are by no means the only types of kind of legitimation narratives. But I wonder if we could speak, to pick an example, speak about the idea of equality and inequality. This is a concept that's quite key to Habermas and Rawls, but these terms get very quickly out of hand. And you point out that the kind of idea of equality that political theorists develop, it's sort of equality of, say, opportunity to participate in a political system. Actually, citizens have a very, very different view of what equality might mean. We spoke previously, and you had this idea of the equity mean, where in the 2020 election, or if not even earlier in the US, somehow the term equity was introduced as though it was synonymous with equality, and suddenly everyone being equal at the same place at the end of the race was somehow the concept. So I want you to speculate a bit about how these concepts become solidified, given that it's impossible to even give a definition of any one of them, and what happens when that solidification doesn't actually lead to any particular change. Like what happens when suddenly everyone agrees that the system is too unequal, but nobody understands what inequality means?
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about legitimation stories, and this is a more precise way of talking about how legitimacy works. So when a state does something, when it acts, if it's doing anything that is really necessary or worth doing, there will be some people who won't agree with what it's doing, and it will have to give some sort of explanation to them if it wants to legitimate itself to them. Now, sometimes people are not included in the audience for legitimation. People like slaves are not given an explanation for what the state does because they're treated as completely subject to its acts. But if the state wants to grant this idea that you are citizens, at least to some point, then it has to try to explain what it does to you, right? So when the state is trying to explain itself to you, it will say that it is acting to advance some value, what I call a legitimating abstraction, right? Now, these legitimating abstractions can all be understood in many different, distinct, potentially conflicting ways. So when the state invokes one of these legitimating abstractions, it can leave it unconceptualized as a kind of floating signifier. You know, when Harris was at the DNC, they had the word freedom repeatedly appearing behind her. And the concept of freedom there, the abstraction is left unconceptualized, so it's floating. You can put whatever you want into it, and different speakers would attach different things to it. And how specifically committed is the candidate to any particular conceptualization? It might be hard to figure that out, especially if there's no policy platform that's credible to which the candidate is attached, right? But you can also do something else that I think is cleverer. And this is to have many distinct people conceptualizing the different abstractions in different ways at the same time, and to position these people as rivals with one another, right? So when Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are in the same race with each other, they might have very different understandings of equality, right? They might conceptualize equality in quite different ways. And these different conceptualizations of equality will appear to be offered to you as a choice, right? But in practice, what will tend to happen with equality is that there will be so many different conceptualizations that will be live at one time that you will not be able to get the state to act on the basis of any one of them. And each political actor who invokes the concept will say to you, I would make this society more fair and more equal, but I can't because there are these other people who don't care about equality, at least not in the right way. And you have to help me get rid of those people. And you could spend election cycle after election cycle after election cycle trying to get enough votes for the people who understand equality in your way. But what will tend to happen in practice is that you will never produce a strong enough consensus on any one conceptualization of it to advance concretely in the direction of that conceptualization. And the state will therefore always be able to offer itself to you both as your champion and as your opponent. And this is where the image on my book cover comes in, the image of the Hydra. The Hydra that's stuck in a tar pit. The state is not able to do very much for you at all, right? But through the heads, through the particular abstract values conceptualized in particular ways, it offers itself to you as your champion. And then when it isn't able to act on your behalf, it goes, I'm trying to pull the monster in our direction, but these other things are in the way. And with equality, we can be talking about things like, what's the currency of justice? Is it welfare? Is it opportunity? Is it resources? Are we trying to equalize individuals, nations, cultural groups, non-human animals, future people, right? We can really, really blow this up, and we can make it very, very complicated. And then there will be people on the right who will say, actually, equality is just equality before the law. And so very, very quickly, you have way too many conceptualizations of this for it to actually perform the emancipatory function that it might previously, and indeed was previously, thought to have. If you go read Habermas, or even Robert Dahl, the liberal American theorist, for these guys, equality has a necessary direction. It develops in a particular way over time, and gradually old conceptualizations become reactionary and then fade into oblivion. So you have this kind of Whig narrative that in the beginning equality was understood in this one particular way, and then we realized that particular iteration of it, and then it gave rise to a new, more radical version of itself, And for a while, there was a fight between these two types, but eventually the new type, which is the spawn of modernity, prevails over the old type, which comes out of a previous historical situation. And so in this way, equality is a parade of different conceptualizations that all go in a row. And you can have a progress, and you can even measure where a country is based on which particular one is operative or dominant in its discussion. No to all of that. None of that reflects what's going on anymore today. Instead, what we have are way too many of these conceptualizations all going at once for the concept to be useful. And so what some people will do, and what I'm hearing more people on the left doing now, is they'll go, equality is shot. Now people are even talking about equity instead of equality, and contrasting equity with equality and acting like those are two different things. No, this has all gotten out of hand. No, equality has been ruined. We have to go back to freedom. But what they don't realize, of course, is that liberty and freedom, this is subject to precisely the same struggle. And all of the same things can be replicated because you've just changed the abstraction. Legitimating abstractions are all ultimately, I think, different versions of the word good that highlight different things and maybe cause you to notice or pay attention to different things that matter to people. When you have this much disagreement, you're not going to get anywhere by winning an argument about a concept. But this is something that political theorists don't grasp, and insofar as they do grasp it, they generally have an incentive to conceal it from you, because a lot of our books are about that.
Benjamin, I tried so hard to make this the positive book, and I almost feel compelled to ask you to conceptualize joy. As one of those values, I think we should have a thesis on the multiple contested meanings of joy that come with absolutely no policy. But look, you've taken us to the current moment with this crisis of equity. The left is having, or the Democrats at least in the US, are having a moment where they have to decide how they will approach exactly those abstractions. What is it that they stand for? They will probably start making coalitions with libertarians, having landed on the word liberty. So I'm still maybe sticking with theorizations. I wonder whether you could plow through the possibilities, because in the book you have a couple of different ways, and this is both you and a couple of other theorists. So presented with a problem, we can either solve it or we can settle it. We can either have a voice or exit from the system. Now, the word exit I found really attractive, like looking around at the general depression of the democratic left, particularly in the UK, that has a little bit advanced. We've been depressed culturally for a few months longer than the Americans because we've had the weak disappointment of Keir Starmer as opposed to the horror, which, at least gets the adrenaline going. What happens at a kind of moment of research? And I have a feeling that you're going to tell me that it's neither of those, that in fact it's the kind of technocratic machine. It's not the people who respond to a legitimation crisis, but actually it's authority that has the reins.
Well, everybody responds. Everybody's got to find something to do, right? There's a question of what you are in position to do. We all, insofar as we are dissatisfied, we have to respond to the dissatisfaction and resentment that the situation creates in some way, shape, or form. And one of the things the book tries to do is catalog the many different ways we can respond and what's likely if we respond in different ways. What is likely to happen? Not to endorse any of the responses, because that's not for me to do. It's up to you to decide how to respond. But to run through what would happen if these particular different responses tended to dominate. And I break it down into 4 moods at the end, 4 different kinds of moods that we can be in. One is the kind of conservative mood, which is the mood that takes the side of existing legitimation stories that have been told for a while, stories that were around 20, 30 years ago, older understandings of what I call the liberal legitimating abstractions, liberty, equality, and representation, which tend to be the abstractions that liberals and liberal democracies want to be operating with. And also, folk, what I call folk legitimating abstractions. These are abstractions that are much older, that predate liberalism, and which are often popular with subjects who have less political education. They maybe haven't gone to university. They're thinking in more concrete material terms about their quality of life or standard of living. And these would include things like peace, order, prosperity, and then also God and nature, right? So these different abstractions, I think, have tended to be understood in a lot of very, very different ways for a very, very long time. And the conservative says that the ways that we used to understand these terms and the terms that we used to prioritize, those are the ones that we really should be focusing on, right? Then you've got the liberal position. The liberal says that the problem is that the terms are not being understood in a way which allows them to have the legitimating effect. And therefore, they need to be revised or reconceived. They need to be reinvented to suit a new situation, right? That's the liberal mood. And it's the mood you'll tend to see liberal and left academics in, right? Then you've got what I call the negative mood. In the negative mood, you have seen the sense in which all of these different stories can be ideological and can prop up a status quo that you don't like and resent. And in this mood, you want to get out from under these things. You want something else. You're looking for some other possibility. But that's very difficult to find because of the ways in which our imaginarium is restricted, right? And the restriction comes from this impossibility of exit. So when I talk about Albert Hirschman, in his book, he talks about how when you don't like something, when you're resenting the way some system is performing, you can use your voice, you can speak up and say, fix this, change this, I want this to be better. Or you can exit, you can stop buying the product, you can leave, you can go somewhere else. The thing is, if you can't do revolution, there is a major kind of political exit that doesn't exist. And in Hirschman's account, if you can't exit, then people don't have to listen to you talk. Because ultimately, what are you going to do, right? If you hate the way Pierre runs this place, and you complain and complain and complain at Pierre, but you've come...
This is being done. That gets us nowhere, precisely your argument.
Right. If you come all the time, no matter who's here, and you always show up and you always pay the £8, Pierre doesn't have to do anything, ultimately, about your complaint.
Well, we might have to cut this short at this stage.
Right. But by the same token, right? With the state, if you can't do revolution, then your talking doesn't matter in the way that it otherwise would. So the abstractions, the conceptualizations don't have the kind of force. So in the negative mood, you're looking for something outside of this that you can actually do, something you can actually say that would matter. But it's very, very difficult because of this restriction on the imaginarium. And then the final response, what I call the enclavist mood, is the attempt to get out of politics and to go into some other part of life that you think of as non-political. And in that space, I put what I call the 4 Fs: faith, family, fandoms, and futurism. And this is where corporations come in because, of course, they make all of the entertainment media and they, through the technology that they produce, give you the visions of the future that seem to be apolitical or seem to be in some other kind of politics that exists way out in the future. Some of the wacky stuff that's out there right now, like the network state, wild futurism that's floating around on the internet, right? Some charismatic genius billionaire and their vision for what the future could be. Then you put them into the government even, maybe. You put them in charge of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and you hope that they can make a future that you like. This stuff seems to have this possibility of getting you out of politics, but it tends to ultimately become repoliticized because when you have a dysfunctional state, you usually also can't have a functional 4 Fs, right? If you have a state that is not able to act, then generally you will not get the kinds of economic support you need for a diverse array of household or family models. It will become difficult to run a diverse array of functional churches, religions. Churches and religions will be pulled into the disagreements and struggles that are going on in politics, and they will become themselves places in which to fight over it. And the same goes for fandoms even, and for visions of the future. These corporations will struggle to offer, say, new Star Wars films or new visions of the future that don't have a political valence, that don't involve any of these other legitimating abstractions, right? What does it mean to have a future that isn't a free future or a fair future or a representative future, a prosperous future, a peaceful future? And as soon as you start to get specific about it, it becomes very political in this highly contested and contestable kind of way. So oftentimes these guys will try to lean on something like authority. They'll go, aren't I very smart? Maybe I have seen some version of the future that you don't understand because you're not an engineer, right? The trouble is that ultimately, as soon as people start to act and to try to pursue different things, we start questioning whether they're smart, because we think if someone doesn't agree with us about human values, that they might not be smart. We don't distinguish these things as neatly as we might like to think. So as soon as somebody gets involved in politics, all of a sudden we start arguing about whether they're smart. You can have a very, very fierce argument online about whether Elon Musk is a smart person, precisely because of the degree to which he's become involved in politics. So these are the different main things that get kicked up. In terms of what the state does, I could give a different answer there.
Do you want to?
Okay.
I want to disagree with you at this stage. I think it's time. I love Benjamin because he's a doomer, and he's a more articulate doomer than I have ever managed to be. But I'm finding it, particularly between the retreat to folk legitimation stories, nature, God, prosperity, those kind of things that have been invoked in the UK context by kind of post-liberal crowds and our conservative values, not that anyone in politics really represents them anymore. And conversely, the 4Fs, the family, the fandom, I'm not entirely sure whether I understand that they are sort of separate to the liberal conceptions. And I've made a complete mess because I've already kind of glued two sets of concepts together. But I'm not entirely sure I understand how, say, God is different to freedom, whether you see them as kind of completely separate legitimation narratives, or whether they're just different versions of sort of replaceable legitimation narratives. Because I'm, in my experience, clearly not as a political analyst, I'm kind of finding that what people are doing is that they are moving quite smoothly between such legitimation narratives. And not to put too much focus on the last American election and the claim that Elon Musk and Twitter won it, but I'm saying Twitter with that stress because it's a cultural space. So the thing that I don't particularly see in your analysis is the cultural aspect of all of this, because there is and maybe political theory doesn't do this. What is the medium in which this legitimating abstraction happens? And I need this conversation to end with me still having a job as someone who's concerned with culture as a pursuit.
So in the new book, we talk about mediating abstractions, right? So a mediating abstraction is not straightforwardly something the state pledges to do, but it's something that the state creates a space for other people to do, right? So the state would not tell you that it makes great Star Wars films, but it creates a space in which artists can create films. And then, whether the films are good, that depends on what the artists are up to. And it has nothing to do with the state and nothing to do with the kind of environment in which the state creates for the arts. No. The state created this free space for the artists to make art. And if the artists make art that people don't like, well, then they should address their resentment to the artists or to the organizations of artists that exist, right? And you see this in the debate, for instance, in Florida between Governor Ron DeSantis and the Disney Corporation, right? DeSantis will say that the reason that there's so much cultural rot in the United States is that the arts are full of these socialist, communist, woke, pinko, blue hair people, right? And he'll say that these people have infected these corporate mediators. And he'll say that what you should do is you should boycott these companies and you should address your concerns to them. And what the companies will then do is they'll act like little medieval fiefdoms. They will break themselves up into lots of different composite bits, and they'll buck pass blame for whatever they make to the point where it becomes really difficult to hold them to account. And they will both make arguments defending the cultural works they make, while at the same time offering up particular parts of themselves for criticism, scrutiny, and potentially for being fired. So in the case of Disney, they'll have Lucasfilm make the films, and they'll attach the films to Kathleen Kennedy. So if you don't like the films, maybe they can fire Kathleen Kennedy, and then you would believe that the films would improve, right? And then at the same time, they also have, say, Sony and they have Lego make these other things that are not made directly by Lucasfilm and that might have different content that you might like better than the movies that are being made, right? And then they've got their proprietary media, Hollywood Reporter, ABC, ESPN. And these guys, they will more or less compel to talk positively about the films all the time and to act like the films are enormously popular no matter what's going on. And then they've got these other mediators, the YouTubers and the content creators and the people on Twitter, the influencers who are quasi-independent, these Quango cultural mediators.
Look, we also have commentators like you and me who don't get paid by Disney, and we can talk shit, and it's fine. I thought you were going to give me a slightly different answer, which is how I want to end this part of our conversation, and that's to connect this narrative and this analysis to the crux of your first book, which hinges on the idea of capital mobility as kind of the ultimate blackmail the blackmail system under which we are living. And I sort of thought that this is what you were going to say about Disney, is that, DeSantis can say what he wants, but Disney Corporation can just say, go fuck yourselves, because you need our dollars even when you're not paying you anything in taxes. Does capital today need democracy at all? I mean, quite obviously it doesn't, because capital is quite happy to thrive under different systems. Is there a case that you see either for or against some kind of capitalist accelerationism? I know I'm kind of attaching it right at the end of your train of thought in the book, but I was so desperately trying to see who could run away with any of these concepts, and I realized, well, actually, there is one force that is not at all impeded by any of this vision. So forget about culture. Can capital just kind of reshape the system to its own demands, to the point that actually brings democracy to a point of break, that being one of the potential positive outcomes for reshaping the system?
Yeah, so I think that capital mobility, and this is to do with the first book, where I really talk about this background condition, which limits what nation states can do, which is this possibility that if they try to tax capital, or if they try to seize it through any other mechanism, it will potentially try to run away from them. Not only will it organize within the society to oppose such a political force, but it will also try to run away and produce a run on bonds or a run on currencies, right? Something that will impose an economic cost, and in this way compel the elected representatives to renege, right? And in this way, you can start with people who are upset about something like, say, inequality. You can have a government which tries to do something about that, say, taxing the wealthy. And then the wealthy can behave in such a way that the crisis moves from being about inequality to being about prosperity, understood in terms of cost of living and inflation, right? And in this way, a crisis that seems to be about one thing can become about something else. And this is because I do think that the abstractions are, as you were talking about earlier, they are related to each other. They're not completely separate, right? And this is in part why we can have these shifts where we move from emphasizing one to another, or one person can start a conversation talking about one and then end up talking about another. So there is a flowing, and there are points in the book where I try to break down the particular stories and be precise and talk about how all of them work. But it should be understood that when you get more precise in theory, you also tend to get less accurate, right? The way that we actually talk about these abstractions has a flowing character to it. It's not so discrete. The theorist can make it discrete for you for the purposes of being able to discuss parts of it that we wouldn't otherwise be able to identify. But ultimately, there is this flowing character to it. But on the point about, does capital need democracy? The reason that capital likes this kind of thing is that it produces eternal false possibilities of it being transcended. All of the abstractions and conceptualizations produce these possibilities of change ideationally or in language. People say, oh, what we need is utopian concepts. We need utopian values. We need an image of utopia. Capitalism is great at making utopian images. It's great at that, right? And the capitalized university system is phenomenal at producing language that sounds really fun and cool and different and new, right? The challenge is to concretize that in a way that's compatible with the actual constraints under which states operate, something that nobody really wants to talk about, because when they get serious about that, they realize all the things they can't actually do, right? So we run away from this into the language. And I think this is the core of what makes this so functional from the point of view of capital. If you want a state that's incredibly credible, that never threatens to undermine the system in any way, the best way to create a really, really credible state is to create an infinite number of conflicting forms of radical language that conflict with each other, pull against each other, and make it impossible for the state to ultimately move. And in this way, the radical language itself becomes not just compatible with the state, but a very, very effective way of perpetuating it. Because in having this very cheap, very easy language that you can use that's readily available to you, you always have an option that's much safer and easier to imagine yourself engaging in than discrete revolutionary activity.
You're not going to sell a single copy of the book because at least a third of the room is filled with political opinion columnists who do precisely what you accuse them of. But maybe at this stage, we've been talking for nearly an hour. We'll have a little break. Benjamin, thank you so much. Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies by Benjamin Studebaker is published by Edinburgh University Press. Thanks for listening and join us next time. Thank you.